much, David, for accepting this conversation. So this is part of a series of talks that we are having with people that we believe are inspiring others and are contributing to a better world. And you for sure.
It's our pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll do a brief introduction, and if you want to complement, please feel free. So David's an evolutionary biologist and a distinguished and emeritus professor of biology and anthropology at Binghamton University, and he's the co-founder of the Evolution Institute and co-founder of the nonprofits Prosocial World.
Right, that's it.
Thank you. So to start, I think one of your great contributions is this the idea or the theory, I don't know how you prefer to call it, of multi-level selection. Could you explain what is it and how was the process of being accepted in the academy, and why it was disputed, and how far is it today, knowledge of it and acceptance?
Sure, Cesar. I'm going to do it by beginning with two familiar examples, and then we'll generalize it from there. But one of my favorite examples was an experiment on chickens to increase their egg productivity. And so chickens have always lived in groups. So imagine many groups of chickens. And then you monitor the egg laying of all of the hens, and you choose the most productive hen within each group to breed the next generation of hens. Or what can go wrong? Turns out that plenty can go wrong. When you do that, what you're selecting is the biggest bully within each group. And you're selecting for aggressive behavior. Aggression is highly heritable in chickens. And in 5 generations, you've produced a strain of hyper-aggressive hens that are actually murdering each other, plucking each other's feathers in their incessant attacks upon themselves. So let's go back to the drawing board, and with those same groups of chickens, we select the most productive groups, and we use all of the hens within those groups to breed the next generation of hens. What you get then, you get cooperative hens that are nice to each other, and collectively their productivity goes way up. And so in both cases, competition took place, but in one case, there was a competition among individuals within each group that led to pathological outcomes. And in the other case, there was a competition among groups, okay? And so we're beginning to get to multi-level selection, competition taking place at more than one level, which might have toxic consequences or benign consequences depending upon the level. Now, let me pause there, Cesar, in the first place to sneeze, and in the second place to get your response to that. And then I'm going to give another familiar example, but hold on just 1 minute.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. I read this example in your book, This View of Life, and it's great. I have a friend that works with this selection of hens, and I was explaining here. He didn't know this. I love it. Please go on with the second example.
Well, the first time I gave that example in a lecture, a professor ran up to me afterwards and said, "My department is like that first chicken experiment. I have names for those murderous hens." And, that's funny, Cesar, but I've just read a scientific article about how before we get to economics and business and politics, in academia, in our setting, in universities, then so often we reward people for their individual achievements. And without knowing it, we're performing the first version of that chicken experiment. And that's no laughing matter. We think we're selecting individuals in a way that's going to lead to benign outcomes. But in fact, what we've done is we've duplicated that first chicken experiment. And so that is no laughing matter. We'll get to that and the many applications of that in a minute. Well, my second familiar example is the game of Monopoly. So I think, do they play Monopoly down there in Brazil?
Yeah.
It's played the world over. And so the single game of Monopoly is a competition among individuals within a single group. And the whole idea is to beat the other players, to drive them bankrupt. There's almost no context for cooperation in a Monopoly game. The only context is when the current losers cooperate with each other to beat the current winner, after which they all begin to compete with each other. And so there's no context for cooperation other than that one in a Monopoly game. Well, now imagine playing a Monopoly tournament where the trophy goes to a team that collectively develops their property the fastest. Suddenly, there's no context except for cooperation within a single group. It's all about teamwork. And yet there's no context for cooperation between teams. For that, we need to add some other layer of competition. And so just as with my chicken example, we're seeing that competition and cooperation can take place at more than one level. And that's true for evolution. That's what Darwin discovered way back when he discovered that if natural selection is all about individuals that survive and reproduce better than other individuals, then how could he explain altruism or any other kind of prosocial behavior? To do that, he needed to invoke competition among groups. And as I summarize this in an article with the evolutionary biologist Edward O. Wilson, we wrote a long article on this, and we ended it by saying, selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups, everything else is commentary. So that's multi-level selection in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. I think this is a good point to make the warning or the dispelling of social Darwinism, because every time that we bring Darwin to the social worlds, some people brings this idea. How and you introduce your book with this chapter. How would you explain or dispelling social Darwinism?
Well, social Darwinism, for most people, is some form of ruthless competition and the justification of ruthless competition as a form of public policy. You should just let individuals compete with each other, let the strongest win. That's what we should be doing. And that's not at all how Darwin thought, for example. Darwin thought deeply about morality and cooperation, group selection, as I've just discussed. And when other people began to think about Darwin's theory of evolution, they used it in all sorts of ways. I think that we can say that anything that's a tool can also be used as a weapon. That's true for ideas in addition to physical tools. And so evolution has been used as a weapon in addition to a tool, but no more so or less so than any other kind of idea. And so while some people took evolution in that direction, other people took it in a much more benign direction. You might know the philosophical tradition of pragmatism, and figures such as William James, John Dewey. These were progressive social thinkers, and they thought about their work in evolutionary terms, just like the social Darwinism. So that's a very complex social history, Cesar. What's most important is for us to be thinking about evolution in a modern sense, based on developments that have taken place just within the last 20 or 30 years, and for the most part are unknown in policy circles. There's a tremendously important body of information that everybody needs to know about in order to basically make a better world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when we go to the social worlds, you adapted or bring the ideas of the evolutions based on genes, and so all the levels of the system from micro level to the macro level. And when we go to the social worlds, we have the cultures, and you adapted the genotypes to symbol types and use meanings. And can you tell us about this translation or the use of the ideas for evolution of cultures and group identities? And so how would you explain it? Because I think this is very important for us in the continuations of this discussion.
Right, and I'm aware as we talk, Cesar, that we're compressing so much information into such a small space, and so hopefully this will be just an introduction. But getting back to history, what we can say is that although Darwin thought very broadly about evolution, including human morality and so on, Darwin knew nothing about genes. For him, evolution, natural selection, was about three things, and let's just get them out there. One is variation. Organisms vary in just about any way that you can measure. Two, selection. Those differences make a difference in terms of survival and reproduction. And three, traits tend to replicate over time. When you put those together, you get Darwin's theory of natural selection. But with the discovery of genes, in the early 20th century, the study of evolution became almost entirely gene-centric, as if the only way that offspring can resemble their parents is by sharing the same genes. And the study of cultural evolution, human cultural evolution, was marginalized. And so evolution seemed to have very little to say about anything that we might care about with respect to our current day and our current cultural practices. That only started to change in the 1970s when I was a graduate student. And so it's only within the last 50 years, and mostly within the last 20 years or so, that we can begin to expand this very important theory to explain all aspects of humanity, including the very capacity for culture. And so what we can say on that basis is that in our species, there's two streams of inheritance. We have the genetic stream, which all species have, and then we have a cultural stream. The way we behave is based at least as much on our cultures as on our genes. This is called dual inheritance theory, and it encourages us to think about everything inside our heads, what you might say our worldviews, our ideologies, our theories, our religions, our meaning systems, as the cultural equivalent of our genes. And so just to repeat this, every person listening to this is a collection of genes. We call that your genotype. And those genes influence just about everything that could be measured about you. We call that your phenotype. Everyone listening to this also has a collection of symbols. Let's call that your symbotype. That also influences just about everything that could be measured about you, the very same phenotype. And so this is what it means to think of our symbolic systems as like our genes. And based on that, it's just hugely informative to be thinking about the inner part, what's inside us, and the outer part, how we act at all scales as individuals, in small groups, in larger groups, and ultimately at the global scale, in all contexts, in our schools, in our businesses, in our governments, in our neighborhoods, in our families, with our loved ones, with our enemies. It's this view of life, as Darwin said, expanded still further to include, as I say in my book, this view of life, completing the Darwinian Revolution, everything associated with the words human, culture, and policy.
Mhm, mhm. And in the approach of multi-level selection, cooperation is very important in different levels. So you always have cooperation and competition in different levels. And I think to show it, it was very important, the work from Elinor Ostrom with the core design principles and the work that she did. And you worked with her. Could you tell us a bit about how was the work with her, and how you generalized that principles to the generalized core principles, the design principles, and what does it mean for this multi-level cooperation?
Cesar, could you repeat that question, because you broke up for me, and I don't know whether it was a bad connection on my part or your part, but maybe you could repeat that question just so that we make sure that we get it.
Okay, and sorry for my camera. Sometimes it turns down. It's not me.
Okay.
When I note it, I open again. So the question is, you worked with Elinor Ostrom, and I believe the work that she did studying the tragedy of the commons, and so in different populations, and getting the Nobel Prize was very, very important. And you generalized the core principles that she achieved. Could you tell us how was to work with her and the generalization, and how important is it for this cooperation in different levels?
Well, Elinor Ostrom is a very famous person and much beloved in a certain circle, and then can be totally unknown beyond that circle. So you and I are talking about her in reverential terms, and I'm guessing that about 90% of the people listening to this have never heard of her. So I need to, now one thing this illustrates, Cesar, is what I call is the archipelago problem, is that human thought and practice are broken up into a vast archipelago of islands of thought and practice, with a little communication among islands. As we talk about silos in the same way. But Elinor Ostrom was a political scientist, and she studied the famous tragedy of the commons. That's the tendency of people to overexploit common pool resources, such as forests or fisheries or pastures or the groundwater. And that tragedy was thought to be inevitable, and the only way to prevent it would be to privatize the resource, or to regulate it in a top-down fashion. And what she showed was that our groups are actually capable of self-managing their common pool of resources if they implement certain core design principles, which I'll list in just a minute. And so that was her great contribution. And I met her just before she won the Nobel Prize in economics, months before, in 2009. This was a time at which, in the first place, 2009 was the year of Darwin. It was the 200th anniversary of his birth and the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. And so Darwin events were being held everywhere. And one of them was held in Italy. It was a workshop titled "Do Institutions Evolve?" And that's where I actually met Elinor Ostrom. And although I was familiar with her work, meeting her and talking with her was just wonderful. And on the spot, I said, Elinor, I want to collaborate with you. And we did. We did for 3 years prior to her death in 2012. And along with everyone else who knew her, she was just beloved. She was such a wonderful, warm, friendly, smiling a person. She asked everyone to call her Lynn, and was just the most wonderful, charismatic personality. And so just about everyone who came into contact with her loved her in that way. And she has many, many devoted students. So what are these core design principles? It's a kind of a recipe for success. And so here they are. Now, in the first place, it's very important to stress that groups trying to manage their common pool of resources, they actually varied in their implementation of these principles. Not all of the groups employed them, only some did. And it was that variation that helped her to identify those principles in the first place. So the groups that worked, the groups that avoided the tragedy of the commons, in the first place had a strong sense of identity and purpose. They knew that they were a group. They knew who was a member. They knew the boundary of the resource. And of course, it was very important for them. And so unless you actually know that you're a group and what that group is about, then that group will not function very well. Secondly, benefit were proportional to cost. It was not the case that some people did all the work and other people got the benefits. That's a recipe for unfairness. Third, decision-making was fair and inclusive. Not the case that some people got to make the decisions and other people were left out. In the first place, that would be a recipe for unfairness. And in the second place, it would not make use of the wisdom of every member. Number four, agreed upon behaviors were monitored. So if we're going to do something together, we have to monitor that so that we know what we're doing, what we agreed upon. Number five, if we're not, then something must be done about it. And so there must be graduated sanctions, but they don't have to start out harsh. If you're not doing what you should, then let's begin with a friendly reminder and only escalate as necessary. And while we're monitoring bad behavior, let's also praise good behavior. So abundant praise for good behavior and mild punishment for bad behavior, which escalates as needed. Number six, fast and fair conflict resolution. Conflicts will occur and they'll need to be resolved in a fair manner. In a dispute, most people think that they have a point of view. Number seven, local autonomy. A group has to be able to have the elbow room to manage their own affairs. If they're being dictated from without, then of course they can't do these other things. And then eight, appropriate relations with other groups, which reflect the same core design principles. And Cesar, this is very important because it means that these principles are scale independent. There is needed to govern relations among groups in addition to relations within groups, all the way up to the national and global scale. So we could use these ideas to look at conduct among nations, conduct among parties within a nation, global corporations are just as important as conduct among individuals in a small group. Now, if you think about these core design principles in connection to the chicken experiment and to the game of Monopoly, we can begin to see that if you imagine a group that strongly implements these core design principles, it's very difficult to play the single game of Monopoly or to be that bullying chicken. If you try, then those core design principles are going to make it very difficult for disruptive, self-serving behaviors. And if you imagine a group where those core design principles are implemented strongly, well, it's like the second chicken experiment, or it's like the Monopoly tournament. It's structured to favor teamwork, basically. It's very, very simple, very, very simple. And so what I did with Lynn was we basically generalized those core design principles from an evolutionary perspective to help us see that they're needed by all groups whose members are trying to do something together can benefit from these core design principles. That's what the evolutionary perspective did, is it took something that had been discovered in the context of a certain kind of group, common pool resource groups, and applies it to any other kind of group. And my very first application of this was in schools. And I know that schools are important to you. So, but we basically were able to design a a school for at-risk youth, and we designed it according to the core design principles. And to make a long story short, it worked beautifully.
Nice. Some of these challenges, for instance, in the tragedy of the commons, are long-term. So in the short term, people may be worrying about next day or feeding. And when Eleanor discovered these principles, she found groups that were following, but were they aware that they were doing this because they had a long-term problem, or was this just a reflection of mutations that were good and she discovered? I'm asking this because I know you created the Prosocial World, and I know that you try to bring this as in the culture, and so I'm trying to understand how do we form people for these long-term goals that are so hard. For instance, what we have now with the global climate crisis.
Yeah, so if I could, I'm going to try to reframe your question, Cesar, and make some general points, which is that evolution doesn't make everything nice. Evolution often results in outcomes that might benefit me, but not you, or us, but not them, and especially short-term, not long-term. So the idea that evolution is pretty good at helping us achieve our short-term goals, but not so much our long-term goals, that's absolutely the case. It's the case for biological evolution, and it's the case for human cultural evolution. And so often, so one point to make is that so many people look at nature and they think that nature is harmonious all by itself. That's not true. I mean, nature very often is just as bad as the worst kinds of human social behaviors. I could tell you so many stories about animal societies that are just despotic in human terms. And nature is full of suffering. And in a modern context, but let's get these two terms out here, Cesar, two meanings of complex adaptive systems. The term complex adaptive systems, that's a major term in complex systems theory, but it has two meanings. One is a complex system that's adaptive as a system, like a single organism, or a complex system of agents following their respective adaptive strategies, and often at cross purpose with each other. And so often in nature, what you find are species have evolved to maximize their own fitness, but this is done at the expense of other species. And so what you find is, as the Buddha said, the first noble truth is suffering. The world is full of suffering. Why? It's because of everyone's trying to satisfy their cravings, is the way. Those are the first and second noble truths of Buddhism. In nature, we could say species evolved to maximize their fitness, and very often that's at the expense of other species. In human life, people, individuals, and groups evolved to maximize their fitness, their welfare, often at the expense of each other. And so evolution is part of the problem here. And again, your short-term versus long-term is part of us. And so the take-home message is that cultural evolution is taking place whether we want it to or not. But unless it's managed in some ways, unless we actually become some kind of stewards of cultural evolution, then it will become the problem, not the solutions. And so it's not good enough for there to be cultural evolution. There must be conscious cultural evolution. We must be smart enough about evolution in order to align it with our valued goals. And only then does cultural evolution begin to become long-term and for the good of all, as opposed to short-term and for the good of only some at the expense of others. And so the entire question is, how do we turn a CAS2 system, a complex system of agents following their respective adaptive strategies, into a CAS1 system, a system that's adaptive as a whole system. And how can we do this at multiple scales, including the global scale?
Mm-hmm. And can you bring some example that you got in the prosocial world? Because I know you've worked with cities and so in a larger scale. Can you tell us some experience?
So one point to make, Cesar, is that I could do this at many scales. I think all the way down to very small groups. And a point to make, well, actually, let me directly answer your question. And we can talk about the smart cities movement. Okay, so that's a familiar term. And so you might ask, how do we make a city smart, and why aren't cities smart in the first place? Why aren't they automatically smart? And let's take just one particular part of the traffic patterns. Traffic patterns. Imagine a city that is poorly regulated with respect to traffic, and all the drivers are making their individual driving decisions. They all want to get from point A to point B, but there's no system to help them do that. Let's say no stoplights or whatever, no planned roads or anything like that. Well, you're going to get horrible traffic problems. And if you want to solve that, how are you going to actually make a city smart with respect to its traffic patterns? Well, you're going to have the whole city in mind. You're going to have to get some people in there that that are able to understand the problem and all of its complexity, put in the right roads. That's going to have to be very experimental. That's so complicated. Nobody's going to be able to figure it out just on the drawing board. They're just going to have to, test out idea after idea after idea. And only then can we, in fact, there's a famous example in Stockholm where they put all sorts of sensors, traffic sensors all over the city in order to help them figure out how to optimize the traffic patterns without building new bridges and infrastructures and things like that. And so, and just one other example, one of my favorite examples is that in the United States, perhaps also in Brazil, there's a 3-digit number that you call for emergencies, 911. That's what you call for emergencies. But some cities have created another number called 311 for reporting any kind of minor dysfunction, not an emergency, but anything that might need to be fixed, like a street lamp that's gone out, or a pothole, or traffic pickup, or anything that needs fixing. You can dial 311, and that gets relayed to the city, and then hopefully they come and do something about it. Well, that's like a perceptual organ. That's like the city's developing eyes and ears. And so you can imagine a system like that makes the city smarter than if you didn't do that. But there's all kinds of problems that you'd have to solve in order to do that. Not all people are literate. That might serve some areas better than others. And so a lot of effort would have to go in to create a good system like that. But if you did, then the city would be turning a little bit more like into a single organism than it was before. And so there's an example of system level selection at the scale of a city.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You have a book on religion, so Newton's Cathedral, Darwin's Cathedral, and I believe your view of religion is very respectful, but it's possible to consider religion as building this, what you called complex adaptation system 1. So the people that in the religion behave like a group, and for that they have this, you called it a vertical dimension, so that collects people. and sometimes you call it adaptive fictions. Can you explain a bit about all these ideas and the role of religion in the cultural evolution and the role of fictions in what's happening? Because this language, it doesn't apply only to religion. So we can think about adaptive fictions for nations, for instance. And so
Yeah, totally.
explain?
Yeah, well, currently we're awash in adaptive fictions now. That's what another word for fake news, and it's so very interesting. So let's do this. Let's calm down. I don't want to rush through this, but and so I think it's important to see religion as one kind of meaning system. You might or might not be religious, but you do have a meaning system. We all do. And so, what can we say about all meaning systems? And I say that they can be evaluated. They need to be evaluated by three criteria. The first criteria is how motivating are they? How psychologically motivating are they? Do they inspire you? Do they get you out of bed in the morning, brimming with purpose? And many religions are good for that. And so are also other ideologies. Some political ideologies are good for that. But all of us should want our meaning systems to be like that. Don't we all want to be inspired in some ways? So the idea that a meaning system should be animating in a psychological sense it's a plus. It's something that we should want. The second criterion is, what does it cause you to do? How does it move you to action? And a good meaning system really should move you to action. What's the good of having a meaning system that leaves you not knowing what to do? And so a good meaning system should move you to action. But of course, it has to be the right kind of action. It has to be action that's hopefully not only good for you, but not harmful to others. So that's the second criterion. How does the meaning system cause you to act? And then the third criterion is, how well does the meaning system comport with scientific knowledge? How much of it actually is consistent with what we know about the world, as opposed to departing from that, being fictional? And I think the meaning systems that we should be striving for score high in all three criteria. They're psychologically motivating, they move you to do the right thing, and we can justify each and every part of it with our scientific knowledge. For me, that's the trifecta. That's what we should be working towards. But if you look at all the meaning systems of the past and most of the meaning systems of the present, what you find is very often they score high on the first two. They're highly motivating and they move you to action, but they depart from scientific knowledge. In other words, they employ what I call adaptive fictions. In religions, that's obvious. Belief in the gods is, I'm an atheist, so I can say this, an adaptive fiction. But if you can also look at, for example, how cultures imagine their own past, and what you find is national histories are just completely fictional. Any scholarly history account can disconfirm patriotic history. So what we find is that very often there's a pretty steep trade-off between creating a meaning system that is highly motivating and moves you to action. And very often that requires the meaning system to depart from scientific knowledge, what we know about the world. And so that's by no means confined to religion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is something that happens with some religions, that is, they don't follow the eighth principle, so that you apply it to other groups that behave like your group. So because they are so exclusive, So this is the right religion. So we have to fight others. That means so they are not cooperative. And for me, this is also very clear when you see religions. I remember one comment you made in, I don't remember where, because I read lots of things from you. A study that you did on visiting churches and seeing how they use the Bible and the sites, but with different meanings from the same source. Can you comment on that? Because this is very illustrative of this symbol type. You use the
Sure. Yeah, this was a study. This
Oops.
was a study that I did. This was a study that I did with one of my students named Yasha Hartberg, and it really gets at this idea that our meaning systems are the cultural equivalent of our genes. And so what we say in that paper is that a sacred text like the Bible looks a lot like genes. I mean, there's high fidelity replication. There's a segmented structure, books versus Bible. I mean, and there's a form of gene expression, so that in any particular moment, what often takes place is that you want to say something apropos, and so you pick an appropriate passage from the Bible, and then you express it and you relate it to action. And so this explains the mystery of how is it possible that Christian congregations can be so different from each other and how they behave. For example, a highly conservative congregation or a highly progressive congregation, and they're all drawing upon the same sacred text. And so what we did was we took a sample of conservative congregations and liberal congregations, and we had their sermons were online, and we simply tabulated what passages of the Bible were they invoking. And we created heat maps, basically, a visualization in which a given book of the Bible or chapter or verse would be colorized to the degree that it was cited. And what we showed was that the huge differences in terms of the passages of the Bible that the different congregations were quoting. So it was very much like a genetic system in which some genes get expressed and other genes don't get expressed. And I think that that's true for any kind of meaning system. We were able to show it well for religions, but everything that you might say about religion, Cesar, including this outgroup part, is true for all kinds of groups. I think, and one reason why I end up being a defender of religion and respectful of religion, as you mentioned, is because I think what you could admire about religion is their ability to form community. And that's a great thing. I want to be able to form community. And so I hope that I do as well as a religion in forming and nurturing community. And then as to how that community interacts with other communities, it's not the case that it's always hostile. It's not the case at all. If you look at relations among species, for example, you find the full range from predation, competition, parasitism, to mutualism and coexisting without interacting with each other. And if you look at the range of relations among human groups, you find just the same range, Groups are not always at war with other groups. Often they trade, or they leave alone, or they nurture. There's the full spectrum. And if we want to improve things still further, then it's up to us to be smart enough as ecologists and as evolutionists to know what are the ecological circumstances that will pull things in the direction of cooperation as opposed to competition and predation and parasitism. How do we alter our environments? We call this niche construction, because so much of the human environment is constructed. We imagine our world and then we make them a reality. the boundary between what we imagine and what is made real is a very flexible boundary. And so this is what makes me ultimately optimistic that despite throughout our entire past, there's been hostile relations among groups. And the whole concept of global cooperation was unimaginable until about 200 years ago. Beyond the human imagination, that there's a whole world that can be cooperative. But now it's like the only thing that makes sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. But I think that we are living hard times since the neoliberalism and so the individualistic movement and some of the dictators or the bullies that we have in some nations. I think it's possible to have a benevolent view of conservatives in the sense that they don't want change to happen too fast, and because we know that the dynamics of the world is going to happen, as you said before. So if you want or not, evolution, it continues, and not always for the good for some groups. But what we have seen from these bullies is that they are creating in a very fast way narratives that are changing. So they bring with them, with these narratives or adaptive fictions, since they are using technology for that. So it's possible to have different fictions for different groups. So they are much more adaptive and they are changing the realm in a different way. And I think this is something different that we had before. And I'd like to hear your opinion, because I'm also optimist, but I think we are living in a hard time to counteract all this new selections that we have due to these new narratives and new technology. What would you recommend? Because we are living this in Brazil right now. We have elections and we have all this fake news, new narratives. And what would you recommend to balance things?
Well, of course, I mean, we also have the same in the United States and worldwide, actually. And so in the first place, we need to have commentary on this. There's others, in addition to myself, that study this very carefully. I might just mention some names for our listeners to look up. Peter Turchin is one. Michel Gelfand is another. The idea of tight and loose cultures that are adapted for collective action are quite different than cultures that are more freewheeling. Brazil is a loose culture. America is a loose culture, but of course can become tight. I want to say that there's forms of conservatism. If we want to talk about liberalism and conservatism, and if we think of conservatism as like sticking to the old ways, and progressivism and liberalism as experimentation, then we could imagine that in most societies we want both. Because cultural evolution results in things that work without knowing why they work. It says we work because that's the way we do things. And there's a lot of wisdom in how we do things. Cultural evolution results in wisdom that nobody knew about or invented. And so if that's conservatism, we need it in some sense, but we also need to adapt to the future. So we could really talk about adaptive mixes of a kind of a spectrum that causes the whole society to operate on an even keel. That's a benign form of conservatism. That's different than bullying and basically some factions gaining at the expense of other factions. And so it kind of comes back to Elinor Ostrom's first core design principles. What is the group? And what is its sense of purpose? If the group is a nation, say, and so that's everyone's primary social identity, I'm first and foremost an American. Whether I'm a Democrat or Republican is secondary to that. It's America that I'm pledge allegiance to. That would cause a certain dynamic between the different parties. But if I'm first and foremost a Republican, then you can see how that would take a very different form. At that point, it's the party that becomes the primary social identity. And it's very easy for everyone else to become the enemy. And so that's what we see is we see around the world, we find that national identities are not working for people. It's here that we need a bit of sympathy for what's taking place. And we could actually blame to some extent the wrong kind of globalism, the kind of globalism that actually does not work well for large segments of the population, or the kind of nationalism that does not work well for large portions of the population. And it's at that point that it's easy to imagine individuals abandoning one social identity, which in fact is not working for them, working for others, but not for me, and then adopting some other identity that does work for me. And as to what's fake news and what's, it turns out that doesn't matter. I mean, that matters like so little. You'll believe just about anything. I mean, we're finding, I mean, it's just the commitment to truth, the idea that there's some authority to the facts of the matter is itself a norm, is itself a social norm. And unless you maintain that norm, then it can go the way of any other norm. You can say any damn thing you want. And it's only for effect. It's only whether you believe it or not is based entirely on effect. Its factual content counts for nothing. Now, if that becomes widespread, then I mean, just terrible things will happen. I mean, I'm not an optimist that way. I'm an optimist in the sense I feel I can see a path towards out of this, but whether that path is followed or not, or whether we just get consumed by one dystopia after another, that could easily happen. So I'm optimistic, but I'm not naive. And so I think that of course these are grave dangers. But if we're going to create a large social identity, it has to work for everyone underneath it. And if people are left out, then they're not going to. That's why it has to be something which is equitable, and I mean truly equitable, all up and down the line. Equity and fairness, the right kind of fairness, have to be baked into it. It's if it's not equitable, then it's not going to be sustainable.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think this is a good point for us to stop. We are having a difficult time here, like as I said before, and so this kind of conversations are very inspiring for us. It shows that it's not, as you said, we should not be naive, but there are paths. They are not simple. But
well, Cesar, could I just steal 5 more minutes of our time here to make, I think, two important points, because we've been very abstract. Yes, and we've been operating at a very large scale. And so my point number 1 is that it's so important for this to take place at the scale of small groups, So one of the messages is that the fundamental unit is not the individual person. That's something that we've gotten wrong. That's something that individualism gets wrong. The fundamental unit is the small and largely cooperative group that's appropriately structured. You can think of that as the cell of multicellular, large-scale society. And so we might or may not be able to do things at a large scale, but something that everybody can do at a small scale is to form themselves into cooperative and appropriately structured groups. You don't have to ask anyone's permission to do that. So one thing we need to do is we need to create the cellular fabric of society. That's bottom up, and you don't need to ask anyone's permission. Isn't that great to know that you can just do that with the appropriate knowledge? And then the second point is what I called enlightened top down. If you're lucky enough to be an influential person or organization, if you're a business leader, or if you're a foundation, or if you're a government, in any position, in order to be an influencer. And if you adopt these ideas, then you can now help to orchestrate the process of cultural evolution where you have influence, and to take part at a larger scale. So we call this bottom up meets enlightened top down. Bottom up meets enlightened top down. And so much can take place on that basis, even if there's many things we can't do and many things beyond our control. There's a lot that's under our control at those scales, bottom up and enlightened top down. I think I'd like everyone to think of what they can do in those two capacities. And everybody can do something of the bottom up variety. Some people are lucky enough to be able to do something from the enlightened top down variety. That's what I wanted to say to end.
Yeah, thank you. It's a much better way to finish. Okay, David, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Cesar.
Thank you.